Okay, good morning and Happy New Year. Morning. Anyway, before I go to the message, I would like to introduce my family. For the first time, they are with me. So my wife, my daughter, and our son, Jigs. My wife and son are at the back. And my daughter was seated in front, right beside me earlier. So the message for this morning is entitled, How to Finish Well. Interestingly, a couple of days ago, I was at a funeral service and I saw a promotion at St. Peter. And it says there, 50% off on US caskets. Okay. So, very fitting for the title of the message this morning. But anyway, the intention of this is for us to think about life, not only at present, but to think about how to finish. Because oftentimes, even Christians are guilty of being short-sighted. We think of the here and now, and we do not think of the consequences of our actions. So this is the reason why oftentimes we find success in our earthly businesses, but sometimes this is at the expense of our Christian life. So we need to understand that when we have a relationship with Jesus, our priorities are challenged to change. In fact, I remember two very important words. One is purpose. So as a believer, what is your purpose in life? We have to evaluate this because if we want to finish well, we have to ask ourselves this question, are we aligned with God's purpose? And secondly, what do you pursue in life? When you talk about pursuing something in life, you think about allocating your time, your talent, and treasures, and what consumes your energy. So when we don't think of the end, oftentimes we allow other things, lesser things, to consume our time, talents, and treasures. So this morning, let me begin with two very important quotes. One is from Francis Chan, and he said, "Do not be afraid of failing, but be afraid of succeeding at things that do not really matter." So let me repeat that. Do not be afraid of failing, but be afraid of succeeding at things that do not really matter. So in other words, we have to evaluate what we are doing. We have to evaluate what we pursue in this life. And the other quotation comes from Richard Blackaby. He said, "Your struggle in obeying God comes from your struggle in loving God." Let me repeat that. Your struggle in obeying God comes from your struggle in loving God. So that's from Richard Blackaby. So in other words, when we find ourselves struggling with obedience, we have to go to the root of the problem, and the root of the problem is our love relationship with God. So this morning in 1 Corinthians, we need to understand a few things before we come to the passage that was read earlier. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4 to 9, for example, we are given a glimpse of what God has provided for the Corinthian church. Allow me to read this verse or this passage. "I always thank my God for you and the gracious gifts He has given you now that you belong to Christ Jesus. Through Him, God has enriched your church in every way, with all of your eloquent words and all of your knowledge, and this confirms that what I told you about Christ is true." Verse 7, "Now you have every spiritual gift you need. As you eagerly wait for the return of our Lord Jesus Christ, He will keep you strong to the end, so that you will be free from all blame on the day when our Lord Jesus Christ returns. God will do this, for He is faithful to do what He says, and He has invited you into partnership with His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord." So the passage speaks of spiritual gifts that was bestowed to us the moment we received Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. So the question now is, how come the church in Corinth during that time, despite all the gifts and provisions and partnership that the Lord has bestowed on them, how come they are not as effective as they should be? I cite three reasons. Number one, they have the gifts and God's promises, but the problem is, number one, they are divided. If you read 1 Corinthians chapter 3, you will read about the division in the church in Corinth. They struggle with serving with one another. They struggle with loving one another. And this is the reason for that division. And in church, if it has members who are not in agreement with one another, will eventually find itself weakening and not able to fulfill its ministry. The second problem is They have the gifts and God's promises, but they are not motivated. Maybe you have seen people who are highly talented but lack motivation. And in that case, giftedness is not the issue, but again, the issue is motivation. Because according to the verse we read earlier in verse 7, you have every spiritual gift that you need as a church. The question is, are we motivated to use these spiritual gifts? And by the way, for those of us who are not familiar, a spiritual gift is an ability given to you by God to be used for ministry. You can find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. And then number 3, they have the gifts and God's promises, but they are not accomplishing God's purpose. You know, it's always important to evaluate success for each and every one of us. You know, if you go around, you talk to business people, talk to students, talk to Christians, talk to non-Christians, ask them about the meaning of success. And it's interesting, sometimes even with Christians, the definition of success is similar to non-Christians. So that's why we have to evaluate. We have to realign with God. We have to identify our purpose and make sure that we pursue what is important to God. So the case with the Corinthian church, if you look at them, because of all the provisions and partnership that God has given them, it seems that they are successful. But the problem is, by God's standard, they are not. And the reason for that is because they failed to accomplish God's purpose, not only for the church, but for them as individuals as well. Now, I remember another quotation, this time from Andy Stanley. He's the son of preacher Charles Stanley. I am sure that many of you are familiar with him. And this is what he said. It is not your ambition, but your direction that will determine your destination. So this is a very powerful and important quotation, since it talks about ambition and direction. You see, a lot of people, a lot of Christians, we would like to glorify God. But the problem is, are we headed to that direction? The sad reality is, oftentimes, we find ourselves desiring to glorify God, but the steps we're taking are actually going the opposite direction. So in the end, instead of glorifying God, we find ourselves going farther away from the Lord. So that's why we have to, once again, realign with God and understand His purpose for our lives. So for the lesson this morning, I want us to think about the future and ask yourself this question. I'm sorry for this question, but how old are you now? And how many years do you think you will still last? Now, the other day, December 24, we visited my grandmother, and I took a picture of him and my son, and can you imagine, they are 100 years apart by age. Because my grandmother is already 101 years old. Grabe. Ang dami ng pinagdaanan sa buhay. 101. And praise God that she's still strong. And I was looking at my son and looking at my grandmother. It's hard to think that two people can be 100 years apart. But God has blessed her with a long life. But you know, somebody once said, oftentimes the problem with people is we all think that we will live up to 100. But you know what? I think the reality is, what age do you think? Now, there was a time I asked this question to a group of people and they said 70. Sabi ko, mag-ingat kayo, yung katabi mo 69 na. Baka sabihin, tinatakot mo, no? But of course, only the Lord knows. But we have to always consider the end in mind. And the reason for this is because most of the things in the past will affect the future. And most of the things in the present will also affect the future. Now, this is the common problem. Oftentimes, we do not consider the effect of the past to the future. Have you seen a calendar, an empty calendar? I'm sure that many of us have already acquired calendars for 2020. And by the way, there's a good news. 2019 calendars are already on sale. 95% off. But the point is this. You see a lot of empty spaces in that calendar, right? You have to fill that in with your schedule for 2020. But if you fail to forgive people in the past, most of the baggages from the past will affect 2020. Even though you have not placed anything in your 2020 calendars yet, but I guarantee you that things in the past will always find themselves, being included in our future. And this is because oftentimes we fail to forgive, we fail to realign with God, and we do things that either compete or complicate our future. What do we mean when we say compete? If you remember Hebrews chapter 12, the author of Hebrews said, we have to do away with sins and things that hinder us from growing in our spiritual life. So what this means is oftentimes we want to glorify God, but the problem is we put things in our schedule that compete with our desire to glorify God. I remember reading this book by author Bill Hybels. The title of the book is Simplified. And one of the things he said is that oftentimes the complications of our schedule comes from our own initiative. In other words, it is self-inflicted. We choose a lot of things, we do a lot of things, we welcome a lot of activities, but in the end, we find it difficult to find time for what is truly important simply because of self-inflicted complications. And for us to be able to make sure that the future will be successful, we have to remove things that compete, and we have to remove things that complicate. If you look at a baby, our son, for example, his life is very simple. He will just cry, get milk, and from time to time have a diaper change. It's a simple life. But have you noticed that as we get older, life becomes more and more complicated, right? We allow people to come into our lives, and we are not selective, and in the process, we create complications. We put schedules in our calendars that may not be aligned with what God wants. In the end, we complicate our schedules. We want to glorify God, but sometimes it becomes so complicated because of the many things that compete with honoring God. And this is the reason why it is important for us this morning to consider 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 24 to 27, and once again realign with God and focus on what is truly important. So let's go to the passage. Since it was read earlier, allow me to share some points from this passage. Number one, when you consider an athlete, he enters the race to run and win. When Apostle Paul gave this particular passage to the Corinthian believers, they were maybe about the oldest Christian would be around 6 years old as a Christian. So it was a young church. So he has to give a description of what a Christian life is. Because oftentimes we focus on salvation and we don't teach people about the continuation of the Christian life. So we rejoice when people come to know the Lord, but we don't give them a realistic view of the Christian life. So Apostle Paul in this passage is giving them a realistic view of the Christian life. And he is telling them we are actually in a race. And similar to a race, we have to run to win. We have to consider the end in mind. And as a Christian, our objective is to glorify the Lord. So having said this, we have to identify which things are unacceptable. I remember I joined a marathon before. I joined a 5K fun run. I joined a 16K fun run, a 10K fun run. And after I joined the 21K fun run, I already stopped because I could not really understand why they still call it a fun run. So anyway, 21 kilometers. It's a lot of running. But anyway, for us to run and win, we have to consider things that are unacceptable. So in a race, walking fast is unacceptable. Jogging is unacceptable. Lagging behind is unacceptable. Showing little concern for the finish line is unacceptable. So as a believer, for us to run the race and win, we have to also list down what things are unacceptable. Because oftentimes, these unacceptable things find themselves into our schedules, into our priorities, and this is the reason why we struggle. We are so lenient with the unacceptable, things that should be non-negotiable. We have to identify that. And Apostle Paul is challenging us to run the race to win. He said in the verse, don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So, run to win. So what Apostle Paul is telling the believers then is, have a realistic view of what the Christian life is. It's like a race. And in a race, we have to run. This is very helpful because oftentimes when you ask Christians to give you a picture of how they understand the Christian life, a lot of people would think of, having it easy. When you talk about prosperity gospel, it's about prosperity. So the goal of the Christian life is to be prosperous. When you think about problems, some Christians think that the Christian life is all about being comfortable. Some people will think about the Christian life as being all about happiness. It's not about happiness, it's not about being comfortable, it's about glorifying the Lord. Author Rick Warren gave a very good definition of worship. He said, to worship God means to give God happiness. So the objective of the Christian life is not for us to be happy, but for God to be happy. And God stipulated in this verse how He will be made happy. And that is by us running the race to win. Secondly, He strenuously disciplines and controls Himself. Talking about discipline and control, it's very difficult, especially at this time of the year, right? If you're going on a diet at this particular time of the year, well, it's going to be very challenging and difficult. Sometimes we ask the question, how come when you're on a diet, food seems to taste better, right? There's craving. I tried intermittent fasting. It ended up with intermittent feasting. When you think about dieting, right, you think about food. That's the problem. Now, Apostle Paul talks about disciplining ourselves and controlling ourselves. Now, let's talk about the physical body. It's very realistic to lose about 1 kilo every 2 months. And I believe it's safe as well. Okay? 1 kilo every 2 months. So in a year, you will lose about 6 kilos, right? So if you're 80 kilos now, you lose 6 kilos at the end of the year. Next year, by the way. How much? So you have 74. If you continue with that, you'll be at 68. Okay? So very realistic. But how come we struggle with that? Because it's easy to set goals. The struggle is the implementation. And the reason why we struggle with the implementation is because of discipline and control. Now what Apostle Paul is saying, as Christians, maybe we have a clear understanding of what the Christian life is. But the question now is, how do we implement this? How do we apply this? How do we make sure that what's in the head, what is clear in our minds, is put into application? So the verse said, all athletes are disciplined in their training. I have friends whom I have influenced to go biking. We got together one time and they called me the father of triathlon. You know why? Because now all of them are into triathlon. I'm the only one who's not. And I told them the reason for that is because I could not take the schedule. You know why? Because most of the races are on Sundays. So I cannot do that, definitely. That's not my priority. But another thing that is very challenging, they either run, bike, or swim every single day. Wow. Invite me to eat Korean barbecue every single day, I will join you. But run, bike, and swim, and sometimes they do a brick training, a combination of 2 of the 3. It's very difficult. But you know what? Day in, day out, whether they have a hectic time at work, they will either run in the morning, do it in the morning, or do it in the evening. They will not go home and rest until they have done what is necessary for the practice that day. And they always have this saying, because they always post it before they run in a race. They say, hard training, easy game. Hard training, easy game. So in other words, before you actually run the race, you have to make sure that you already are able to finish the distance specified in the race even before the race begins. So that ensures that they become victorious. And I always see them posting about their personal record, meaning they're able to outperform themselves every race, meaning they are very strict in their training. Somebody once said, this is part of the reason why we struggle with discipline and control, because you will not commit to something you don't consider significant. You see, when you talk about the Christian life, you have to see the spiritual realm, spiritual things as significant. If you don't see spiritual things as significant, you will not commit to it. If you see financial things or money as significant, you will notice the amount of commitment you give for that. I have friends who are into stock exchange, what's the other, business investment, foreign currencies. They monitor, the stocks every day. They do that. Why? Because to them that is significant. But if you consider spiritual things as significant, you will do it. You will commit to it. And for you to be able to successfully do it, here's a practical thing to do. You have to have a to-do list, and then of course, a stop-doing list. And I think this is very important. Because a lot of Christians, every time they get inspired, they add another entry to their to-do list. But what they fail to do is to remove an entry from that to-do list. And that is the reason why we complicate our lives. So you have to also have a not to do list or stop doing list for you to be able to succeed. And then thirdly, the runner runs to obtain an incorruptible crown. We have to look at what prize awaits those who will win the race. In the passage, it says, talking about the runner who runs a particular race, he said, they do it to win a prize that will fade away. But we do it for an eternal prize. So we should not lose sight of that eternal reward. And oftentimes, the things of this world attract us to the point that we lose sight of the eternal reward. I was doing a study of this, and I learned that what they actually get for winning a particular race is, that laurel leaf that they put on your head. Nowadays, bibigyan ka ng medal. No? Somebody once said, with millennials, it's different. Before, only the first, the second, the third will get a prize. But with millennials, you get a medal for joining. Right? So palagi lahat finisher. Finisher lahat. So anyway, the point is, they're not doing it for any particular financial reward, but they do it for glory. Now, God is reminding us through Apostle Paul that we do it for an eternal prize. So the question for us this morning is, how real and how desirable is that eternal prize for you? Because if you don't consider it as significant, you will not commit to it. So how real and how desirable is that eternal prize? We have to reevaluate ourselves and make sure that we run the race to win so that we will get that eternal reward. And number 4, he runs and fights with certainty and without distraction. I like this verse, 1 Corinthians 9:26. He said, I run with purpose in every step. You know what that means? It means that every day you should get closer and closer to your goal. Every decision you make, whether it is business or family decision, education or whatever decision, make sure that it brings you closer and closer to the objective of finishing the race well. Sadly, for us Christians, we don't think of the end in mind. Sometimes we look at decisions that are seemingly attractable at the moment, very attractive, but the problem is we get attracted to them. It complicates our lives. Instead of bringing us closer to the goal, it takes us farther away from the goal. And this is the reason why so many backslide and they do not finish the race well. And then lastly, he masters his own body. 1 Corinthians 9:27, look at this. I discipline my body like an athlete. Take note of the second part of that particular phrase. Training it to do what it should. Training it to do what it should. Author John Maxwell said, for something to become a habit, you must do it 21 days straight. After doing it for 21 days, it becomes a habit. What time do you wake up? I usually wake up at around 4 a.m. But it was never that way before. Notice that when you adjust the time you wake up, the struggle is real, right? For example, if you're used to waking at 7 a.m. and you want to wake up at 4 a.m., especially for millennials, what they usually do is they set the alarm clock at 3:45, and then another alarm clock, the phone, at 4 a.m., and then another one at 4:15, right? And then you miss all 3. Okay, after you wake up, you say 5 more minutes. Okay, you put that, you push that snooze button, right? So it's difficult, but once you get used to it, almost every day, even without an alarm clock, you would wake up. Why? because you have trained your body to do what it should. And this is very important. For us to acquire new skills and spiritual discipline, we have to train our body to do what it should. In fact, if we are complacent now in our spiritual life, the reason for that is because we have trained our bodies to become complacent. Or perhaps we have trained our bodies to do what it should in other things, but not in spiritual things. So that's why Apostle Paul is challenging us, make sure that you discipline your body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. I remember talking to a group of young people. I asked them, how's your morning devotion? And most of them said, Pastor, the problem is we go to school at 6 a.m. We cannot have morning devotions. I struggle with waking up early, one of them said. And I asked him, what time do you sleep? And he said, 2 a.m. Okay, so that makes sense, right? You struggle with waking up at 4 a.m. because you basically sleep at 2 a.m. I remember taking a friend and a church mate to a motorcycle event. It was a Saturday night. We were there Saturday afternoon. So we arrived maybe about 5:30 in the afternoon. 7 p.m. And this is a grown-up. He said, Pastor, can we go home now? I said, why? It's still early. We still have a lot of things to look at. He said, no, at home we are required to be at home by 7 p.m. 7 p.m. Why? Matanda mo na, 7 p.m. You know what he said? Because our parents trained us. This came as a rebuke to me as a pastor, as his pastor, by the way. He said, because our parents trained us to be at home by 7 p.m. because we need to sleep early Saturday night so we will be ready for worship on Sunday morning. You see that? They were trained to do that. And now that they have children, they still maintain that family spiritual discipline. Why? Because to them, Sunday worship is very important. So, why am I saying this? Because they have trained their bodies to do what it should. They have set their priorities. Have you ever find yourself wanting to do something for the Lord but having no time to do it? Here's a practical tip. Look at your 2020 calendar. Fill it in with all the church activities. All the things that you want to do for the Lord. Make sure that you filled up that calendar with things that really matter to God. And then everything else. Your business, date with your friends, and everything else should be secondary. Because oftentimes the problem is, we complete our calendar schedules with all of our secular activities and finding no time for what is, or things that matter to God. So do that, because He is more important. By the way, the meaning of the word discipline, it says here that it is a training that corrects, it molds, it perfects the mental faculties or moral character. It's about self-control. So train yourself like an athlete. And number 5, and lastly, he guards against disqualification. This is not about losing salvation, but this is about losing that reward. Right? So in verse 27, he said, otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. So when you think of disqualification in mind, you think of making sure that every step counts, because you do not want to be disqualified. I remember the words of an author who said, if we are to please the Lord, we must be willing not only to revise our ideas, but to reform our lives. So the Christian life is not just about embracing new teachings, it's not just about being loyal to our doctrines, but it's also about reforming our lives and allowing it to be more consistent with the teachings that we receive from the Lord. So let's look at this picture as we come to a close. Consider the future. What are the things in your past that compete with your future? Or the things that you have now that compete with your future? Think about 2 things. Think about things that will complete, and not compete. So what things should I do now in the present that will complete and not compete with my goals? And what things will contribute and not complicate? Okay? So think about things that will contribute to your overall goal. So instead of complicating our lives, let us simplify it by making sure that we choose things that complete and things that contribute. And let me end with this warning. I said this at the beginning of the message. As Francis Chan said, do not be afraid of failing, but be afraid of succeeding at things that do not really matter. Let us pray. Father, every day is a gift from you. Another year will come to an end and a new year will begin. And we acknowledge, Lord, that this year possesses a lot of potential. This coming year has a lot of potential to glorify you. But it's really up to us, Lord, how we fill in each calendar schedule, how we use every day of that particular year, and what decisions we make at present. I pray, Lord, that you would guide us and help us to, first of all, determine what is truly important to you and align with that objective, Lord. And I pray that you would help us, Lord, to make the right decisions based on what is important to you, so that in the end, instead of life becoming complicated for spiritual matters, it will become easier for us because we have chosen things that will complete and not compete, things that will contribute and not complicate. Our objective, Lord, is to honor you. So we pray, help us to do that in every decision that we make, in every day that we use in this lifetime. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.